Hasn't been much more than a week since the death of Aaron Swartz, and the internet, of course, and all the tech community has been buzzing, passionate discussion, debate about the meaning of his death, the significance, and who is to blame for the awful situation. One guy who's written a very interesting piece on the Swartz situation is James Allworth. He's a writer at Harvard Business Review. He was also a guy who worked with Clay Christensen on his latest book. James, welcome to TechCrunch TV.
Thank you for having me, Andrew. I really appreciate it.
So, James, you've written an interesting piece on the Harvard Business Review called Aaron Swartz, Crime and the Business of Breaking the Law. Is there a business of breaking the law? And what was your point about Swartz's crime, or perhaps the absence of a crime in the narrative?
Right. So it seems there is a little bit of a business of breaking the law, and I think that's what the heart of the article was about. It was setting the context of this whole scenario. Swartz had been charged with 13 felonies, could have faced up to 35 years in jail and up to $1 million worth of fines. I wanted to draw a little bit of comparison to how the justice system was treating Swartz versus a few other folks who've been through it recently. Obviously, everyone would have heard of what happened with HSBC, money laundering for the drug cartels, and the prosecutors decided no criminal charges. And there's another case that's less well known of a medical devices company that was encouraging the off-label use of a bone cement, encouraging it to be injected into people's spines. It hadn't been properly tested. People died. One executive was sentenced to 9 months in a plea that actually was a misdemeanor, and another executive only had to face 5 months. And so it's just this idea of the relative comparison between what's happened and the way that the system has dealt with it. It seemed to me to be extremely unfair, especially, given what Swartz's intentions were with his actions.
James, wouldn't it be fair to say, though, that your argument could be used with anyone who goes to jail? Why did you bring up these farmer examples? What's so relevant about Wall Street in comparison to the Swartz case?
I mean, that's a great question, Andrew. I think my point is that there has been something of a corruption of the political and in turn the justice system. If you're a big organization making big donations to Congress or to the Senate, or if you've got a powerful lobby that's been helping writing the laws, then you can make sure that should you do something wrong, that the penalties are nowhere near as severe. You compare that with Swartz, who obviously was not doing anything like that. His actions viewed in that light were those of a pirate. He was downloading articles illegally, potentially distributing them, and a lot of money's been spent to try and stamp that scourge out. So I think the broader point was just that, yes, absolutely, we could make this point about anyone going to jail, but the system isn't being fair in the way that it assesses these people and fair in the way that it creates these laws.
James, there's a new movie out, an excellent movie actually, that I think everyone should see, called The House We Live In. It's a movie about the American criminal justice system when it comes to drugs, and the way in which almost a whole generation of African-American men have been put in jail over the war against drugs. One of the people in the movie, actually a white guy, got a life sentence for possessing a small envelope full of drugs. When you compare that and that aspect, the corruption of the criminal justice system, to what happened to Swartz, doesn't the Swartz case kind of pale in comparison, in spite of the tragic details of his own particular case?
I mean, absolutely. But I think this is an instance where two wrongs don't make a right. That case that you described is notable because I think you would tell it to a reasonable person on the street or show it in a movie and people would be somewhat horrified. I mean, I think everyone accepts to some extent that you want to do something to prevent the scourge of drugs, but the idea that because this guy received a life sentence for doing that, that everyone else should receive a proportionate sentence for their wrongdoings, I'm not necessarily convinced it's the right benchmark. In fact, if anything, I think it's only going to prove my point. This guy had a small envelope. Did you say drugs or money?
Drugs.
Yeah, drugs. And I mean, you compare that.
It was a third-time offense, of course.
Right. So I mean, there are always details like that, you know, that are important to it. But even still, a lifetime sentence for that doesn't seem reasonable. I compare it again to those examples that I painted before, like HSBC executives money laundering for the cartels in Colombia and in Mexico, and these guys are able to do that and get off without any criminal charges whatsoever. HSBC faced 5 weeks worth of profits in fines. I mean, it seems faintly ridiculous to me.
James, there's been some pushback against the support for Swartz.
Sure.
A columnist in I think it was the Boston Herald, argued that Swartz was offered by the federal prosecutors 6 months in jail at a low security jail, and that this idea that he was really being threatened with 35 years and billions and millions of dollars of fines is actually an illusion. What do you make of that, of this argument that he could have gone to jail for 6 months, he could have become a symbol of the injustice of this particular law, and he perhaps could have dealt with that much more effectively than what he actually ended up doing?
Right. Well, I mean, I think the question is whether the law is just in the first place, and I personally have a question around that. In terms of taking a plea for 6 months, and my understanding is that the prosecutors were going to ask him to plead guilty to all 13 felonies. Again, it's just a case of comparing that to some of the recent examples of where they've seemed to have gone much, much softer on people who, to my mind at least, have done much worse things. Those executives in that Synthes case, that was one of them 5 months of jail, yes, but ended up that the crime that he pleaded guilty to was not a felony at all, but rather a misdemeanor.
James, do we need new laws? Do we need an Aaron law, a Swartz law when it comes to computer crimes?
Well, look, I think there are some useful things being talked about now. I think that there was an instance of prosecutorial overreach here, and I think, you know, the talk about investigating whether that happened and trying to make sure that doesn't happen again, I think that's a good thing. And similarly, the Aaron law, which would remove the risk of being considered a felon if you break the terms of service for an IT contract or a terms of service contract. I think those are sensible things. But I think this, when you step back, it's part of a larger, much more systemic problem that really needs to be solved. And that is that while there is the ability for well-endowed individuals and well-endowed corporations to donate money into the political system, that the laws that come out of that and the way that justice is served is always going to be corrupted. And I think that, for me, is what brought, and I know Aaron was a big campaigner in this space, but I think that, for me, is the issue. It's not an instance of one bad prosecutor. It's not an instance of one new law. I think the issue is much more systemic, and I think that's how we should be looking at it.
James, finally, in 5 or 10 years or 20 years' time, how do you think people will think about Aaron Swartz?
I don't know. I mean, I hope his death was not in vain. He was a brilliant young kid. In 26 years, he'd already accomplished so much. And, you know, I think he felt trapped by what was happening. Incredibly principled, and I truly hope some lasting good comes of these tragic circumstances.
Well, James Allworth, you've definitely, I think, created an important work, an important debate around this subject. I want to thank you. I hope next time you come on my show, it'll be on about a more cheerful subject. But thanks for the piece, And we will look forward to having you on TechCrunch TV again in the not too distant future. James Allworth, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.